Okay, so this video is going to show you how to draw out a color wheel in order for you to paint and start in with our color theory unit. So we're going to learn about the 12 basic hues on the color wheel, and it's going to start with the 3 primary colors, yellow, blue, and red, our 3 secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, and then our 6 tertiary colors, yellow, green, blue, violet, red, orange, and yellow, orange. So we end up with 12 basic hues. So what you're going to be getting is a nice piece of 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. This is really nice, high-quality paper that works really well. It can accept a lot of watercolor and moisture without wrinkling up and getting damaged. And you're going to need a ruler and one of our little safety compasses. So the first thing that we're going to do, this piece of paper should be about 9 inches across if you measure that with your ruler. And just kind of in about the middle, I'm going to measure, it's right at 9 inches, and I'm going to put a little tick mark right in the very center, which would be at the 4.5 measurement. Then I'm going to turn my paper to the side, line it up with that 4, go right up to that 4.5 inch mark. Again, center it up on the 9 inches from the 0 to my 9, and now find the next 4.5 tick mark. And that second one is going to be the exact center of my piece of paper. So I can erase that first one and this little dot right here. So I've measured down 4.5 and over 4.5, and that gives me my perfect middle. Once you've got that down pat, we're going to take our little safety compass and line the little metal part up right in the middle over top of that dot. And then I'm going to come over to the side and find a dot, a little hole that is close to the edge but not right on it. I don't want to be right on the edge, that's too close, but I'm going to come in just one more little section and very lightly bring that circle all the way around. Now if you've measured and found your center, that should work nicely, and you should have about the same distance all the way and hit all four sides. Now, so that's our basic circle, and now we're going to divide it up into our 12 little sections. So I'm going to start off by very, very lightly finding a true horizontal, and as lightly as I can, bringing that line across. And then I'm going to find a nice true vertical, and very, very lightly bringing that line down. All the lines we make inside of our circle, we want them to be extremely light because watercolors are a completely transparent material. So if you have really heavy dark marks, they're going to show right through your paint colors. So you want to make sure that you're drawing as lightly as you can. Another important rule with watercolor paper is you want to try to avoid erasing as much as possible. It isn't really going to matter so much out here on the outside because eventually that part will get cut out when we get it down to our nice finished color wheel. But just anything on the inside of our circle we don't want to erase if we can at all help it. So now we have our space divided up into 4 quarters. And what I'm going to do now is divide it up into each quarter into 3 parts. So we have a total of 3, 6, 9, 12 sections. So what I'm going to do, since I don't want to just draw lines and hope that I get nice even thirds, I'm going to use a trick that I've developed to help me guesstimate it on the outside. So if I need to erase any mistakes, I can. So based on this to this, I use 2 fingers to sort of guesstimate where I get 3 about even spaces. And I'm just going to start off on the outside of that circle with those 2 little tick marks to get 3 spaces. Then I'll take my pencil and measure from the first space and see how wide it is, and just kind of pinch that measurement with my thumb to the tip of the pencil, and then move it over and compare it to my second space. Now notice my second space looks a lot shorter, and then I'll compare it to my third space and it's also a lot shorter. So that tells me that this first one is much bigger. So I'm going to scoot my tick marks over and over, and then I can easily erase, and all that erasing is done outside of my circle, and I'll test it again. Check that first measurement, see if it's the same. That's much closer, that's better. That second one, I think if I scooch it just a hair more, that'll have it perfect. And I'll check it again. 1, 2, 3. Now those are all nice even spaces. So once I know where even thirds are, I'm going to very lightly line this mark up with my center and bring it all the way across. And the same thing with this one. And again, these lines, you can just barely see them on the screen, but they should be very light, and when you get finished, they should look like nice, even thirds. And the nice thing about doing this is while I've measured it here, I've also divided this quarter. So now I'm going to rotate my paper and do the same thing for this section as well. Okay, so I just took a moment and I went ahead and divided that next section and brought it all the way across, and now you should be able to count, and you should have 12 nice even spaces. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is go around the edges and write out the abbreviation for each color. So I'll start with red, red orange, orange, yellow orange, yellow, yellow green, green, blue green, blue, blue violet, violet, and red violet. So that's going to be a nice way for me to remember what colors I need to paint where. I'm going to also flip it over on the back and write my name in the middle, and then flip it back over. Now, with masking tape, or blue painter's tape will also work really well for this. Just whatever table surface you have, desk you have to set up on to work on, you are going to tape this down to your work surface and just barely cover up about 1/8 of an inch along the edge of your paper. You don't want to cover up any of your circles, so just right along the very, very edge on all 4 sides. This is going to be what's called stretching the paper, and this is going to help prevent the paper from warping and curving from where we're wetting it with our watercolors. And just go right up next to that edge, but try really hard to not cover up the edge of your circle. Now, once you've got this done, you are now ready to start painting. Okay, so you're going to have some watercolor supplies in order for you to start painting. You're going to have a palette, a little styrofoam tray with the 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. And then you should have just a water cup that you can throw away that's disposable, something that you won't ever use for food again, and a little watercolor brush. You'll also need some paper towels to help you dab off your brush if you get too much water as you're working. So we're going to paint just the primary colors first, and I want to show you what sort of happens. I tend to be a messy watercolor artist, and I tend to mix my colors, and then I end up with a yellow that has turned completely green right there on top. If that happens to you, don't panic. All you need to do is take a wet brush with clean wet water and swirl that around and remove that top layer of color until you get it back to a nice bright yellow. Some art teachers will not let you mix colors at all in the pan, but I do it myself, so I'm not going to hassle anybody else for doing that. So all my other colors are nice and clean, and they look like they are ready to go. So I'm going to start by painting my yellow section, just because it's my lightest, brightest color, and I want to make sure I don't get any other colors mixed into it. So the trick with watercolors is you want to use a lot of water. You're going to pull some of the pigment from your pan onto your tray, and you should swirl it around. You want it to be a nice consistency, not too thin, not too much water, and not too much pigment, but somewhere right in the middle. And then my trick for painting is, of course, get yourself to where you can spread yourself out a little bit. This is a little bit too close. I would have this off the side. But I'm going to paint in just this yellow section, and I like to have my brush turned to where the tip of the bristles, I can follow along the edge of that section in nice, smooth, fluid motions. And then I like to turn my hand to where I can see the other side and edge in that section first. I don't like to use the underside of my brush, like if I were brushing along this way, it'd be the underside of my brush painting that edge, and if I do that, I can't really see where my edge is. But just make sure you load your brush and follow along the edge. Grab more paint whenever you need it, and then once you've edged it in, you can fill in that color. And the same thing along the side here. So just edge it in, and just make sure you're turning your hand in such a way that you can see where the edges of your brush is touching, so that way you don't go outside of the lines. Now once I've edged in and filled in a paint section, I like to just go back through one more time really gently and kind of smooth out the color, just to make sure I'm getting a nice even coverage and it's not pooling and messing up in some places. And then I'm going to let that color dry. I'm going to rinse out my brush, find a new clean spot on my palette, and I think I'll paint my blue next, and be ready to mix it. Now it's very important, we're going to paint just the primaries first, red, yellow, blue. It's very important that I don't skip and paint the color next to this yellow, which would be yellow green or yellow orange, because while this color is wet, if I paint another wet color right next to it and those two areas meet, they're going to do what's called a bleed, where those colors are going to mix together along that edge and produce really ugly, not clean lines. Now there are definitely times in watercolor painting where you want that, but for this exercise we want nice, clean, straight, even, pretty lines. So I'm just going to mix up and give myself a little section of blue on my palette. And do the same exact thing. I'm going to edge it in, turning my bristles to where I can see the edge of my bristles, and then fill in and grab more paint as needed. Watercolor is all about sort of slow, controlled motions. It's very easy for this to get really messy and get out of control and for you to go outside of your lines. So this is a great project because it teaches you a lot of patience. Take your time. Be really gentle with watercolors. You don't want to scrape your brush back and forth because that'll end up deteriorating and damaging your paper surface. So you want all your brush strokes to be very controlled, very careful, right up to those edges. And there's the blue. And now I'm going to get ready to do the same thing with my red. Okay, so now that I have my red section finished, you can see I've got those three colors, they're evenly spaced out, and I'm going to give them a chance to totally dry. Once they totally dry, I will then come back in and paint a second coat on them just to make sure that they're really, really nice and vibrant. Usually one coat, as it dries, it lightens a little bit, and then a second coat is going to make sure that your colors are really, really nice and vibrant. Once those have completely dried, you're then going to switch and we're going to start mixing the secondary colors, greens, violets, and orange. So I think I'll start with the orange color down here in this section. And the idea of mixing your secondary colors is you want them to be perfectly centered between your two primaries. It should be an even balance of red and yellow to make orange. I don't want it to be too close to red, or else I won't have enough room for my tertiary red-orange. And I don't want it to be too close to yellow, or else I won't have enough room for my tertiary yellow-orange. So I want to make sure I find an orange that's right, nice, smack dab in the middle. So over here on your palette, I already have some red and yellow mixed up that's still wet. So I'm just going to go and mix straight into those. I'm going to get some yellow, and then I'm going to grab a little bit of my red and mix those colors together until I have what I think is a nice balanced orange. I tend to notice that yellow is such a light pigment that you usually end up needing a little bit more yellow than red to actually find a nice true middle orange. But you can sort of experiment with that. And then the nice thing about this is you're going to have this extra space around the outside of your circle. You're going to use that space to test your color out and see if you think it's right in the middle. I think this has a little bit too much red in it, so I'm going to go back and add a little bit more yellow into my color. A little bit more water, a little bit more yellow. And then I can test that color again. I think that looks better. That looks more like a true middle orange. And then I'm okay to go ahead and start painting that section. One thing you have to really worry about when you start painting multiple sections at a time is that you don't rest your hand and set your hand down in wet paint. I have done that before, and then it will smudge and smear everywhere. So just try to be really cautious with where you're resting your hand, and that will help make sure that you have nice craftsmanship in your finished product. So there is my orange section. Again, once I'm finished, I'll kind of lift up and grab a little bit of extra color and just do a once over to smooth that pigment out. Really gently, just to make sure everything's nice and even. And then I'm going to let that section dry. I'm going to rinse my brush, and now I'm going to come over and mix my violet. And for this exercise, I want to introduce you to a new color that we're going to use to mix our violets. This one's a little bit different. The red pigment that I'm using for my just pure red is what I would consider a warm red. It just looks like a standard fire truck, nice, bright, warm, standard red. Now, this red makes a beautiful orange because orange is a nice warm color. But for the violet, if I mix equal parts of this warm red and blue together, it does make a violet, but it tends to be kind of like a really dull, not very pretty violet. So what I'm going to introduce you to next is what I call a cool red. So this will be the fourth color on your palette. This cool red is going to look more pink, sort of magenta in color, and it's going to make a really lovely violet. So I'm going to use this cool red when I mix my violet, and then later on when I mix my blue violet and red violet. So same thing. Take a little bit of my pigment, so I've taken a little bit of that cool red and a little bit of my blue and mix those together, and I'm going to try to find a nice middle violet. Again, I can use the outside of my paper to test. I want to make sure it doesn't look too red and it doesn't look too blue, but that it's right in the middle. I think I'll add a little bit more blue to it. And test it again. That looks about right. You want to look for a nice color that looks like grape. Then I'll paint that violet section. Introducing that cool red can be a little tricky and can be a little bit confusing, but just remember with violets, mix that cool red instead of the warm red, and you'll have really, really nice, pretty, vibrant violets. And then I'll paint this section. Okay, so there's my violet painted, and now I'm going to start mixing my green. Now, if you get to a point on your palette where you have a whole bunch of colors and everything's sort of mixed up and jumbled, this palette is just styrofoam. If you want, you can take your colors off and just rinse this whole thing underneath the sink. Or you can take a wet brush, wet an area, swirl that color around, and take a paper towel and wipe it out to give you some fresh, clean mixing space, just as you need. Also, another important thing is when your water cup gets really dirty and really dingy, it's probably a good idea to rinse it out and get fresh water. You can just pour this down the sink. These are safe, non-toxic watercolors. They'll wash out of clothing or your skin if you get them on you. But just dump that water out and get nice, fresh, clean water. It'll help keep your colors brighter and purer and more pigmented. So, these colors are starting to dry down here, so I'm going to rest my palette there. And I'm going to start to mix my green. I have a little bit of red on there, on my yellow, so I'm just going to rinse that off. I want it to be a nice pure green, so I don't want to mix in any other colors and dull it down. So I'm going to start. And remember, yellow is that lightest color, so you usually need a little bit more of it than you do of the other pigments. Blue is really powerful. It very quickly turns colors. And I'm just going to look for a nice middle of the road yellow, green, test it out, smidge more blue, and then that should be good. And then I'll paint my green section. Okay, so that's my green section complete. And so now I have my 3 primary colors, yellow, red, and blue, and my 3 secondary colors, orange, green, and violet. What I would do is wait and let all of those colors dry, and then go back in and add a second coat on those secondary colors, just to make sure they're really, really nice and vibrant. Once everything at this stage is totally dry, then we'll be ready to start in with the tertiary colors. Blue-green, yellow-green, yellow-orange, red violet, and blue violet. Okay, so once your primary and secondary colors are totally dry, you're going to start to mix your tertiary colors, and that will really fill in your whole color wheel. What you want to look for when you're mixing those tertiary colors is, say for example, between red and orange, is you want to find a nice middle in between. It shouldn't look too orange and it also shouldn't look too red, but something that's right in the middle. And you'll notice this is a color wheel that I've completed that just has, I think, one color, one coat on each of those colors. You can see colors like yellow-orange and yellow-green. I definitely need to add another coat of paint to those because they do look fainter and paler than all of the other colors. These would be examples of nicely finished, everything's nice and bright, and each color is a unique, separate, individual color. Yellow-green looks very different from the green and the yellow, blue-green, and so on. So when you're finished with your color wheel, what you're going to do is very carefully peel up your tape. I like to pull it away at an angle so I don't tear my color wheel. Peel it up, and then very, very carefully, following right along the edges, you're going to cut that out. And you should have your name on the back, and then you'll have your nice finished color wheel.